It's a truth we don't like to admit. Civilization wasn't built on reason, virtue, or some noble instinct to cooperate. It was built on a chemical haze. Long before the first city walls rose from the earth, before kings and empires, before the first myth was etched in stone, there was a ritual that bound us together. A drink, heavy with the warmth of fermentation, its vapors curling through the night air. Archaeologists tell us our ancestors settled the land to farm grain, and that grain was for bread. That's the story we teach, a clean, sober origin. But the soil hides another truth. At Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known temple, there are no homes, no fields, no signs of daily subsistence, only towering monoliths and massive stone vats stained with the ghostly residue of fermented mash. The people who carved these stones did not gather for food, they gathered for intoxication. And it wasn't reckless indulgence, it was survival. Because alcohol, even before we named it, was a technology. A tool that disarmed fear, rewired trust, and stitched strangers into a tribe. In those moments of altered consciousness, we stopped being solitary animals and became something else, a species that could imagine, remember, and build. You think civilization was born in the field? Number, it was brewed in the basin. The origins of humanity's relationship with alcohol are not found in the orderly furrows of cultivated fields, nor in the clay amphorae of the first cities, but in a far older theatre, the humid, fermenting forests of the Miocene epoch, millions of years before the first Homo emerged. In those forests, survival was a race for calories, and the victors were not always the strongest, but those with senses tuned to an invisible chemical signal. Ethanol. Fallen fruit, ruptured by the hooves of passing animals or the heat of the sun, became micro-laboratories for yeast, which consumed sugars and exhaled ethanol. A volatile compound that carried on the wind like a whispered promise. Robert Dudley's drunken monkey hypothesis argues that this attraction to alcohol was no dangerous indulgence, but a strategic adaptation etched into the genome by the relentless pressures of natural selection. Ethanol was not merely a scent, it was a map to food at its caloric peak, dense with energy, easier to chew, and free of much of the fiber that slowed digestion. Those who could detect it from afar found the richest fruit before others, converted its sugars into energy, and survived to reproduce. Around 10 million years ago, a key mutation appeared in the ADH4 gene, radically improving our primate ancestors' ability to metabolize ethanol quickly, preventing the dizziness and poisoning that felled other species. That single enzymatic shift transformed alcohol from a toxic hazard into a reliable nutrient stream. And it was passed down, generation after generation, until it became part of what it means to be human. Yet the true depth of alcohol's influence lay not in the gut, but in the brain. Ethanol slips effortlessly through the blood-brain barrier, binding to GABA A receptors and silencing the amygdala, the ancient node of fear and suspicion that once kept our ancestors alive on the savannah. Simultaneously, it coaxes the mesolimbic dopamine system into overdrive, flooding the neural circuits that evolved to reward food, sex, and social bonding. It heightens the release of oxytocin, the hormone of trust, and lifts serotonin levels, softening the edges of anxiety. In this state, vigilance is lowered, but social courage rises. Strangers feel like allies. Enemies seem less threatening. Isolation dissolves into the warm illusion of belonging. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar's studies of primate social limits, the so-called Dunbar's number, reveal a hard ceiling on natural cohesion. Non-human primates maintain bonds through grooming, a slow, intimate act that physically reinforces trust. For early humans, this meant that group sizes could rarely exceed 50 before tensions and suspicion tore them apart. But alcohol became a tool that could override this evolutionary limit. A kind of chemical grooming that scaled up the effects of trust and cohesion to dozens, even hundreds of individuals at once. Where grooming took hours, intoxication could synchronize the emotional rhythms of a crowd in minutes. And the archaeological record tells us that this was not theory, but practice. In the Levant, 13,000-year-old Natufian stone mortars carry residues of malted grain not prepared for bread, but for beer. The starch is deliberately converted to sugars, then to alcohol. In Jiahu, China, 9,000-year-old pottery shards hold the chemical ghosts of a complex brew made from rice, honey, and fruit, suggesting fermentation was understood and deliberately cultivated long before the plough. At Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, the world's oldest monumental site, immense limestone basins stand capable of holding hundreds of liters of liquid. Far too much for daily sustenance, yet perfectly suited to fuel collective feasts drenched in alcohol. Strikingly, these sites predate formal agriculture. The people who built them were not settled farmers, but mobile hunter-gatherers. The evidence suggests a reversal of the traditional story. They did not invent alcohol because they farmed. They began to farm because they wanted alcohol. And when they drank together, something alchemical occurred in the human mind. In the blurred warmth of intoxication, language loosened, myths were woven, and collective memories formed, not in the isolated consciousness of individuals, but in the shared identity of the group. Cooperation extended beyond bloodlines, enabling alliances between clans and the pooling of resources for projects that would have been impossible in smaller, suspicious bands. Temples could be raised, large-scale hunts could be coordinated. Knowledge could be preserved not only in words, but in ritual. Alcohol, in these contexts, was not a diversion from the serious work of survival. It was the very medium through which that work became possible. It reduced the psychic costs of living among strangers, accelerated the bonding necessary for large-scale collaboration, and gave rise to the first glimmers of what we now call civilization. And all of it began with a molecule that once drifted from a piece of rotting fruit in an ancient forest, carrying with it the faint promise of safety, pleasure, and trust. Ethanol was never just a drink. It was an evolutionary technology, a biochemical lever capable of moving the architecture of the human brain, rewiring our capacity for social complexity, and, in doing so, altering the trajectory of our species forever. When humanity finally crossed the threshold from forager bands into sedentary settlements, the intoxicating rituals that once bloomed in temporary clearings under the stars were pulled into the architecture of permanence. Alcohol, once brewed in clay pits by communal hands, became a tool not just for binding kin, but for binding subjects to systems of power. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, reveals that the earliest written tablets were not poetry or laws, but ledgers tracking the distribution of grain and beer rations to laborers. Sumerian temple complexes functioned not only as religious centers, but as breweries, the sacred and the administrative fused in a single fermenting vat. The gods were offered libations, and the priests, in turn, offered alcohol to the people, not as a gift of the divine, but as a ration for obedience. Here, alcohol ceased to be purely reciprocal and became transactional. Its flow could be regulated, taxed, withheld. In Egypt, beer was woven into the labor economy, fueling the very workers who raised the pyramids. In the Andean civilizations, chicha, A maize beer was brewed in vast state-run facilities and dispensed at festivals engineered to reinforce loyalty to rulers. In every case, intoxication served two masters. It dissolved the interpersonal tensions of dense populations, and it reaffirmed the hierarchy by making the state the sole legitimate source of the elixir. This pattern echoed through history. As empires rose, alcohol moved through the veins of their armies and bureaucracies. In Rome, wine was the mark of citizenship and conquest. The provinces that resisted Roman control often faced the flooding of their markets with cheap wine, a liquid weapon that softened resistance and integrated them into the imperial economy. In medieval Europe, alehouses were both public forums and surveillance hubs, where information flowed as freely as drink, and where tavern keepers, often licensed by local authorities, became unofficial extensions of the state. The cognitive and social effects that once enabled hunter-gatherer cooperation were now directed toward maintaining the stability of increasingly complex hierarchies. Alcohol's neurological fingerprint, its capacity to quiet dissent by lowering fear and amplifying social cohesion, found its most efficient expression when coupled with propaganda, ritual, and spectacle. Religious institutions recognized its dual nature early. In ancient Sumer, beer was linked to the goddess Ninkasi. In Dionysian cults of Greece, wine was the blood of ecstasy. In Christianity, wine became transubstantiated into the blood of Christ, sanctifying intoxication itself. In each iteration, alcohol was no longer just a drink. It was a sacrament, a coded message that submission to the communal ritual was submission to the order behind it. Yet as production methods advanced, a new era dawned: the age of distillation. Originating in the medieval Arab world as a means of concentrating perfumes and medicines, distillation eventually reached Europe, where its power to turn beer or wine into spirits increased alcohol concentrations to lethal efficiency. Suddenly, intoxication that once required hours of steady drinking could be achieved in minutes, and the state was quick to notice. In the 17th and 18th centuries, colonial powers turned distilled spirits into instruments of economic expansion and social control. The British Empire used rum as currency in the transatlantic slave trade. Traders exchanged it for human lives in West Africa, then sold it again in the Caribbean to workers on sugar plantations. Plantations whose very output fed the stills that produced more rum, a closed loop of exploitation. In North America, whiskey became both a symbol of frontier self-reliance and a taxable commodity whose control sparked the Whiskey Rebellion, crushed by federal troops to establish the supremacy of centralized authority. Capitalism refined the lesson that ancient priests had learned millennia earlier. Alcohol is most profitable when its supply is monopolized and its consumption ritualized. In industrial cities, breweries and distilleries sponsored working-class festivals, sports teams, and public houses, cultivating brand loyalty that blurred the line between personal identity and corporate product. The very neurochemical pathways that once helped strangers cooperate on the plains were now weaponized by marketing departments, which learned to associate alcohol with sex, adventure, and belonging. The same primal cues that had once bound early tribes together for survival. Psychological research in the 20th century confirmed the potency of this manipulation. Studies showed that alcohol not only reduced social anxiety, but increased susceptibility to suggestion, a fact not lost on political regimes that lubricated rallies and celebrations with state-supplied drink. Even the language of intoxication shifted. Happy hour, liquid courage, raising a glass, each phrase a soft command to normalize what was, in biochemical terms, a temporary rewiring, of human judgment. And beneath this surface of conviviality, addiction spread quietly, its risk amplified by the concentration of modern spirits and the constant availability of cheap alcohol. By the late 20th century, corporations had perfected a global supply chain that could flood markets anywhere, anytime, while governments reaped tax revenues so vast they became structurally dependent on maintaining high consumption levels. Efforts at prohibition, from ancient edicts to the American experiment of the 1920s, revealed the paradox. Suppressing alcohol only drove it underground, where it became even more profitable for those willing to flout the law. The molecule that had once served to unite scattered hunter-gatherers had been fully integrated into the machinery of empire, religion, capitalism, and the state. It was no longer simply a facilitator of human cooperation. It was an engineered dependency, a biochemical leash whose length was decided by those who controlled its production. By the modern era, alcohol existed in a strange dual role, celebrated as a symbol of freedom and identity, yet functioning as a quiet governor of human behavior, regulating energy, descent, and cohesion with far more precision than any law or weapon could achieve. In the fluorescent glow of the contemporary bar or the branded stadium beer stand, the lineage is invisible. But every poured glass still carries the genetic echo of rotting fruit on a forest floor, the ritual smoke of Göbekli Tepe, the sealed amphora of the Sumerian temple. It is the same ancient molecule, only now dressed in the armor of commerce and the banners of nations, still whispering the same promises, still tightening the same bonds, but no longer in the service of the tribe, in the service of systems far larger, colder, and more enduring than any single human life. The story of alcohol does not end in the neon haze of the 20th century. It is only now entering its most calculated phase, a stage where the molecule's ancient seductions are fused with the precision of modern neuroscience, genetic engineering, and globalized marketing. The coming century will not merely inherit humanity's taste for intoxication, it will redesign it. Corporations already deploy neuroimaging to study how ethanol alters activity in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, mapping the exact thresholds where inhibition collapses and suggestibility peaks. Artificial intelligence passes trillions of data points from purchasing histories, social media posts, and biometric sensors, learning to predict not only who will drink, but when, how much, and under what emotional triggers. The beer before bread impulse that once led our ancestors to plant the first fields will be met with synthetic alcohols, molecular analogues that mimic the dopamine and GABA surges without the traditional hangover, keeping consumers in a perpetual state of mild euphoria, a chemically engineered contentment that does not disrupt productivity but quietly dulls the impulse to rebel. The line between intoxication and medication will blur as pharmaceutical giants patent compounds that deliver curated social boosts or relaxation profiles, tuned to individual genetic markers for alcohol metabolism. Governments, recognizing the strategic utility of such tools, will fold them into policy. In states where dissent is dangerous, these substances will be subsidized or discreetly introduced into mass distribution products, an invisible sedative woven into the daily ritual of life. In hyper-capitalist democracies, the same mechanisms will take the form of premium experiences, subscription-based access to personalized intoxicants that promise the perfect buzz for the perfect occasion, paired with augmented reality environments that simulate the warmth of human gathering without the complications of real human relationships. The psychological dependence, once accidental, will become infrastructural. Social cohesion, traditionally threatened by political polarization, will be chemically smoothed into manageable compliance, each demographic calibrated to its preferred intoxicant profile. In such a future, alcohol as we know it, the fermented grain or grape, may become an anachronism, a heritage drink preserved for cultural tourism, while the real market operates in labs and server farms, refining the ancient biochemical spell into something indistinguishable from identity itself. The consequences for human autonomy will be profound. Our species' evolutionary knack for bonding over intoxication, which once allowed small tribes to cooperate in the face of scarcity, will be leveraged to make individuals feel connected in ways that no longer require shared purpose. A simulated belonging that satisfies the tribal brain while leaving the body politically inert. The rituals will survive, but stripped of their original survival logic. Festivals, sports events, streaming watch parties, all synchronized with global marketing campaigns and real-time biometric feedback to optimize both emotional engagement and chemical dosing. Addiction will cease to be a side effect and become a design principle embedded not in back-alley liquor, but in the legal, normalized architecture of everyday life. Attempts to resist will face a paradox far sharper than prohibitions. The alternative to the engineered euphoria will be the raw, unfiltered reality of human existence, and for many, that will feel intolerable. Underground movements will emerge, some rejecting all synthetic intoxication, others brewing ancient-style alcohol as an act of rebellion, their gatherings echoing the fire-lit rituals of prehistory. But these will be fringe, marginalized, and often criminalized. The mainstream will march forward under the influence of a perfectly balanced chemical leash, invisible yet unbreakable. Its formula adjusted not by chance fermentation, but by algorithmic governance. This is the ultimate evolution of the beer before bread thesis. The molecule that once coaxed our ancestors into planting seeds will now be used to harvest compliance itself. And somewhere in the ruins of forgotten temples and broken amphorae, the ghosts of Ninkasi and Dionysus will watch, perhaps amused, as their intoxicating gift, once bound to the chaos of human will, becomes the most precise instrument of order ever conceived. A quiet, golden thread looping through the synapses of billions, weaving the final tapestry of a civilization that began and may well end under the same warm blur of a drink shared in the fading light.